They beat our
Stay
mom.
close. I've
She's
got you.
on the floor. She won't wake up. There's blood everywhere. Please, please, you have to help us. Two little blonde girls, barefoot dresses, torn blood smeared across their knees, burst through the front door of Wanda's roadside grill at 12 minutes past noon on a Tuesday in the middle of July. The heat outside was brutal, 101 degrees into the shade, the kind of southern summer heat that makes the asphalt shimmer and the air taste like rust. Inside the diner, the air conditioning hummed at full power, and 14 people sat in various stages of their lunch force, midway to mouths coffee cups, halfway between table and lip conversations, half finished, lives half lived. The girls didn't run to the young couple by the window who looked kind and clean and safe. They didn't run to the retired school teacher in the corner booth who smiled at children everywhere she went. They didn't run to Deputy Roy Skaggs, who sat 3 tables from the door with a badge on his belt and a department-issued sidearm on his hip and a mouthful of pulled pork sandwich. They ran straight to the biggest, most terrifying man in the room. Colt Ironside Drayton sat in the last booth on the left, the same booth he'd occupied every weekday at noon for 6 years running. He was 61 years old, 6'4", 260 pounds of weathered muscle gone slightly soft around the middle. Faded prison tattoos crawled across both fists. The letters on his right hand spelled hold. The letters on his left spelled fading. A scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw, white, and raised a souvenir from a knife fight in a Myrtle Beach parking lot 30 years ago. He was a former Hells Angels enforcer. Carolina chapter. 25 years patched in. He'd done 4 years in state prison for aggravated assault. He'd broken bones that didn't belong to him. He'd collected debts with methods that would keep a therapist busy for decades. He was the kind of man that mothers cross the street to avoid, that bartenders serve quickly and carefully, that police officers watch from a distance with one hand resting near their weapons. He hadn't raised his voice in 3 years, hadn't thrown a punch in 5, hadn't touched his .38 special in 20. The most dangerous thing he'd done this week was argue with Wanda over whether her meatloaf needed more pepper. That all ended in 4 seconds. The first girl grabbed his sleeve so hard her knuckles went white against the cracked leather of his vest. She was small, maybe 7 years old, with tangled blonde hair and eyes so blue they looked almost electric against the red of her tear-streaked face. Her sundress was torn at the shoulder. Her feet were bare and dirty, the soles scraped raw from running on hot pavement. "Please, you have to come. He won't stop hurting her." Her twin sister stood 1 step behind, shaking so violently her teeth chattered despite the July heat. She held something crumpled in her fist. It took Colt a moment to realize it was a piece of fabric torn from a woman's blouse soaked dark with blood. The girl's fingers were wrapped around it so tight the tendons stood out on the backs of her small hands like guitar strings. He kicked her. The second girl whispered, her voice barely audible above the air conditioning. He kicked her, and she stopped moving. Every conversation in Wanda's roadside grill died at once. Forks froze midair. Coffee cups hovered. 14 people sat in that diner, and not one of them moved. Colt looked across the room at Deputy Roy Skaggs. The deputy had stopped chewing. His eyes were fixed on his plate. His hand, the one closest to his badge, had moved to his lap out of sight, as if by hiding the badge, he could hide the responsibility that came with it. Then Colt looked down at the 4 small hands gripping his jacket, and something shifted behind his eyes. Something old and heavy. Something he thought he'd buried so deep it would never surface again. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was recognition. The desperate grip of a child asking for help from a world that had already failed her. He stood up. His shadow swallowed both girls completely. His hands, scarred, tattooed, built for violence, came down gently on their shoulders. The gentleness surprised even him. It felt like borrowing someone else's gesture, wearing a coat that didn't quite fit. But the girls didn't flinch. They leaned into his palms like flowers leaning toward light. Where one word, no wasted breath. Orchard Lane. The first girl choked out between sobs. The White House with the blue door. Please hurry. Please. Colt turned to Wanda, who stood frozen behind the counter, with one hand pressed flat against her chest as if holding her heart in place. She was 63 years old and had seen plenty of trouble walk through her doors over the years. But this was different. This was 2 children covered in someone else's blood. Call 911. White House, blue door, Orchard Lane. Woman down. Tell them to send everything they've got. He was already walking. The girls grabbed his hands, one on each side, and pulled him toward the door with a strength that shouldn't have been possible from bodies that small. It was the strength of terror, the kind that comes when survival stops being an instinct and becomes a decision. Colt paused at the threshold. He looked back at Deputy Skaggs, still sitting in his booth, still staring at his plate. "You coming?" Skaggs didn't look up. Colt filed that away in a place where he kept things that mattered. He'd remember it later. He'd remember it for a long time. Before you continue, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now back to the story. They moved fast down the sidewalk. The heat rose from the concrete in visible waves, distorting the world at the edges like a fever dream. The girls half ran, half stumbled, their bare feet slapping against pavement, hot enough to fry an egg. Neither girl complained. Neither girl slowed down. The first twin, the one who'd grabbed his sleeve, never let go of his hand. Her grip was fierce and absolute, like she'd decided this was the anchor that would keep her from drowning, and she would die before she released it. The second twin gripped two of his fingers with both of hers, squeezing so tight the circulation cut off. Her face was blank in a way that children's faces should never be blank. Not the blankness of calm, but the blankness of someone who has seen so much that the mind shuts down its processing center and runs on pure instinct. "What's your mama's name?" Colt asked. He kept his voice level. Calm. A learned calm forged in decades of chaos. Not the calm of someone who doesn't care, but the calm of someone who knows that panic is a luxury they can't afford. "Marlene," the first girl said. "Marlene Prescott. But everyone calls her Marley. And who hurt her?" The girls exchanged a look. That twin look, the kind where an entire conversation happens in half a second without a single word being spoken. Volumes of shared pain and shared knowledge passed between those two pairs of blue eyes in the time it took Colt to draw a single breath. "Wade," the second girl whispered. "Our stepdad, Wade Crenshaw." And the way she said his name, like the syllables themselves had edges, like the word could cut her mouth on the way out, told Colt more than any explanation ever could. "He does it a lot," the first girl said quietly. She was watching the sidewalk as she walked, stepping over cracks with the automatic precision of a child who'd learned to navigate dangerous ground. But this time was different. This time she fell down and she didn't get back up. Colt's jaw tightened until the muscles in his neck stood out like steel cables beneath the weathered skin. But his voice stayed gentle. A man his size, with his history, with his face, had learned long ago that gentleness required more strength than violence ever did. "You did the right thing coming to get help. Both of you. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen." "Mama said you'd help," the first girl said. And the raw trust in her voice, the complete faith in a plan she'd rehearsed but never expected to use, nearly broke him in half. Then the second girl said something that stopped Colt's feet on the hot pavement. "Mama told us to find you." Colt looked down at her. "What?" "She told us, if something really bad happens, run to Wanda's diner. Find the biggest man with the tattoos on his hands. She said his name is Mr. Colt, and he sits in the same booth every day at noon on the left side near the back." The first girl nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "She made us practice. She'd say, 'What's his name?' And we'd say, 'Mr. Colt.' And she'd say, 'What does he look like?' And we'd say, 'Really big with pictures on his hands, and he wears a leather vest, and he has blue eyes.' And she'd say, 'Where does he sit?' And we'd say, 'Last booth on the left.'" Colt stood perfectly still in the middle of the sidewalk. The sun hammered down on his shoulders. The girls tugged at his hands, urging him forward, but for 3 full seconds, he couldn't move. She knew his name. Marlene Prescott, a woman he'd never spoken to, never met, never even noticed, knew his name, knew his booth, knew his schedule. She'd studied him. She'd chosen him. She'd trained her 7-year-old daughters to find him in an emergency the way you'd train someone to dial 911 or find the nearest exit. He wasn't a random stranger. He was part of a plan. "How does your mama know who I am?" Rosie spoke, the quiet one with the bloody fabric in her fist. Her words came slowly, carefully, like she was reciting something memorized. "Mama said she watched you for a long time. She asked Miss Wanda about you. Miss Wanda told her you were scary but good. Mama said sometimes scary is what you need when nobody else will help." Colt started walking again, faster now. They turned onto Orchard Lane. Nice street, nice houses. The kind of neighborhood where people painted their shutters and hung wind chimes from their porches and put up American flags on the 4th of July. The kind of street where people mowed their lawns on Saturday mornings and went to church on Sunday mornings and minded their own business when they heard screaming through the walls on Tuesday nights. The White House with the blue door sat at the end of the block. From the front, it looked fine, respectable. A clay pot of geraniums on the porch steps. A lawn ornament shaped like a rabbit sat by the mailbox. Wind chimes hung from the porch railing, tinkling softly in the breeze, like they were trying to pretend everything was beautiful. But the back door was hanging off one hinge. "Stay behind me," Colt told the girls. He went in through the back. The kitchen was destroyed, plates shattered across the linoleum. A wooden chair broken into 3 separate pieces against the far wall, the impact point marked by a dent in the drywall the size of a man's fist. A handprint large male bloody smeared across the white surface of the refrigerator door, like a cave painting left behind by something primitive and violent. And there on the living room floor, 6 feet from a coffee table that had been flipped on its side, lay Marlene Prescott. Colt had seen violence. He'd caused violence. He'd spent 25 years in a world where blood was as common as beer and broken bones were a cost of doing business. He'd stood over men he'd put on the ground and felt nothing more than the dull satisfaction of a job completed. But something about seeing this woman crumpled on a threadbare carpet in a house that smelled like fear and cleaning products, and something coppery that he recognized as blood. Something about her brown hair matted against her scalp, the dark stains spreading beneath her head like a halo painted in the wrong color. Something about her arms thin, arms a mother's arms covered in bruises, both fresh and yellowing, a timeline of abuse written on her skin in purple and green and black. Something about the way her chest rose and fell so slightly that Colt had to kneel beside her and watch for 10 full seconds before he could confirm she was still alive. Something about all of it hit him in a place he thought he'd sealed shut decades ago, a locked vault inside his chest, a room he'd bricked up and walked away from, and he felt the bricks crack. He dropped to his knees beside her. The carpet was damp under his weight. He didn't look down to see why. "Marlene, can you hear me, Marlene?" Her eyelids fluttered. A thin line of blood traced the curve of her cheek and collected in the hollow of her collarbone. Her lips moved, but nothing came out except a thin sound that might have been a word or might have been a breath that had forgotten how to be either. One hand lay palm up beside her head, the fingers curled slightly inward like a flower that had closed for the night. Colt noticed her fingernails, bitten to the quick every single one. The nails of a woman who lived in a state of permanent anxiety, who chewed her own hands because it was the only act of destruction she was allowed to commit on her own terms. "Marlene, my name's Colt. Your girls came and found me. Help is on the way. You hear that? Those are sirens. That's for you. You just hold on." Her hand shut up and grabbed his wrist. The grip was weak but desperate. The grip of a drowning person reaching for a rope, allege anything solid in a world that had turned entirely to water. "The girls." Her voice sounded like gravel scraped across broken glass. "Where are my girls?" "Right here, Mama." The first twin called from the doorway, tears streaming in twin rivers down her face, her small body trembling in the frame of the kitchen entrance like a leaf that couldn't decide whether to hold on or let go. "We're right here. We found Mr. Colt, just like you told us. Don't let them see me like this," Marlene whispered to Colt. The words came out between shallow, ragged breaths. "Please don't let them remember me on the floor." Colt looked over his shoulder. "Girls, I need you to go out to the front porch and wait for the ambulance." "Okay." "Wave them down so they know which house. Can you do that for me?" The first girl hesitated. The second girl didn't move at all. She stood in the doorway with that bloody fabric still clenched in her fist, her blue eyes fixed on her mother with an intensity that belonged to someone 3 times her age. "Go on now." Colt said it firmly but kindly, the way a man speaks when he needs to be obeyed, but doesn't want to add any more fear to a room that's already full of it. "Your mama needs you to be strong for just a few more minutes." "Can you do that?" They went, reluctantly, looking back every other step. But they went. Colt turned back to Marlene. He pulled the bandana from his neck and pressed it against the gash above her right eye. The blood soaked through the fabric almost immediately, warm and dark, turning the faded blue cloth to black. Marlene, how long ago did this happen? I don't know, she breathed. 20 minutes maybe. 30. He left. Took his truck. He was screaming. Said he'd be back. Said next time he'd finish it. Wade Crenshaw. Her eyes went wide. The terror in them was a living thing, an animal trapped in a space too small for its body, clawing at the walls of her pupils. Don't say his name, please. He'll come back. He always comes back. He never goes far. He just drives around until the rage builds up again, and then he comes back and it starts over. He's not coming back tonight, Colt said. Not while I'm here. Something shifted in her expression. A crack in the armor of fear she wore like a second skin. A tiny, almost invisible flicker of trust, fragile as a candle flame in a hurricane. She studied his face, his tattoos, his size, the scars that told the story of a life lived at the edges. And whatever she found there, whatever she'd been watching for through the window of Wanda's diner for the past 6 months, she seemed to find it now. Then she said the words that would keep Colt awake for weeks. Tell her, Marlene whispered, gripping his wrist harder. Tell her I never wanted this life. Tell her I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Tell who, Marlene? Who do you want me to tell? But her eyes were already closing. Her grip loosened like a rope letting go. Her hand fell away from his wrist and landed on the carpet with a soft thud that seemed louder than the sirens now screaming on the next block. Marlene, Marlene, her chest rose, fell, rose again. She was breathing but barely. Each breath was a negotiation between her body and something that wanted to pull her under. Tell her. Tell who. The paramedics came through the door fast and loud, barking orders, dropping equipment bags, snapping blue gloves onto their hands with practiced efficiency. Colt stepped back to give them room. Pressing himself against the wall of the living room, his bandana still in his hands, soaked through with Marlene Prescott's blood. He watched as they stabilized her neck with a cervical collar, started an IV line in her left arm, called ahead to Cedar Falls Memorial Hospital with a list of injuries that made his stomach turn, even though he'd thought his stomach was beyond turning. 3 broken ribs, at least 3, one of which had likely punctured the left lung, possible internal hemorrhaging, severe concussion, multiple lacerations to the face and scalp requiring immediate closure, bruising consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. Repeated, not just today, not just this week, not just this month. This had been happening for a very long time. Outside on the porch, Colt found the girls sitting side by side on the top step, holding hands, watching the ambulance, with wide, unblinking eyes. The first girl had stopped crying. Her face had gone blank again. That terrible, learned blankness. The kind of blank that children shouldn't know how to make. The kind that comes from seeing too much too young too often. The second girl still clutched the torn piece of her mother's blouse. She held it against her chest like a talisman, like the fabric itself was keeping something alive. Is she going to die? The second girl asked without looking up. Her voice was flat, stripped of everything except the question itself. No, Colt said. He put every ounce of certainty he possessed into that single syllable, compressed all the conviction his 61 years had given him into 2 letters, even though he wasn't sure it was true, even though the paramedics' faces had told a different story. No, she is not going to die. You promise? The first girl asked. She looked up at him with those blue eyes, serious beyond their years, searching his face for the thing children always search for in the faces of adults. Truth. Not comfort, not reassurance, but the actual unvarnished truth. Colt knelt down on the porch, bringing his face level with theirs. Up close, he could see the dark circles under their eyes, the hollowness in their cheeks, the way their collarbones pressed too sharply against their skin. These girls weren't just scared. They were exhausted in a way that went deeper than one bad night. They were exhausted the way people get when fear is the first thing they feel when they wake up and the last thing they feel before they sleep every single day for as long as they can remember. I promise I will do everything I can to make sure your mama gets better. And I promise you this, nobody is going to hurt you. Not tonight, not ever again. You understand me? Both girls nodded slowly. Their eyes never left his face. Now, Colt said, the ambulance is going to take your mama to the hospital. I'm going to drive you there myself. And I'm going to stay with you until she wakes up. That okay? The first girl looked at the second. The second looked at the first. That twin conversation again, a whole language spoken without sound, a dialogue conducted entirely through the smallest movements of eyes and eyebrows and the corners of mouths. Okay, they said together. As they loaded Marlene into the ambulance, the first girl told him her name was Lily. The second girl, the quiet one, was Rosemary, but everyone called her Rosie. They were 7 years old. They'd be 8 in October. Colt watched the ambulance pull away with its lights spinning, but its sirens silent, which meant Marlene was stable enough that they didn't need to announce their urgency to the whole town, but critical enough that they weren't wasting any time. Then he noticed something that snagged in his brain like a fishhook catching on a log beneath the water. Her wrist. As the paramedics had loaded Marlene onto the stretcher, Colt had seen it clearly. A Cartier watch, the real thing, not a knockoff. He'd spent enough years around stolen goods to know the difference between genuine and counterfeit, and that watch was genuine. 18-karat gold, worth more than most people's cars. And there, half hidden under the overturned coffee table, was a Louis Vuitton handbag. Not the fake kind sold at flea markets for $30. The real thing. The kind that costs more than most people's monthly rent. Expensive things in a house with an empty refrigerator and utility shut-off notices stacked on the kitchen counter like a paper monument to poverty. In a neighborhood where the paint was peeling and the gutters sagged and the lawn ornament, Rabbit, had one ear broken off. Something didn't add up. He drove the girls to Cedar Falls Memorial in his old pickup truck, a 2004 Ford, with 200,000 miles, a cracked windshield, and a passenger seat that smelled like dog hair because Rebel, his ancient Labrador mix, rode shotgun everywhere. The girls climbed in without being told which side to sit on. They went straight to the middle of the bench seat and pressed against each other so tightly they might have been a single organism. Rosie still held the torn fabric from her mother's blouse. Lily held her sister's free hand. Neither spoke. Colt didn't push them. Silence, he'd learned across 61 years of living, sometimes says more than words. And the silence of these two girls said everything. It said we have been quiet before. It said we have learned that quiet keeps us safe. It said the world is loud and dangerous, and the only person we trust completely is each other. Colt drove carefully, 10 under the speed limit, checking his mirrors every 30 seconds, out of a habit that had been burned into him during decades of living on the wrong side of the law. The truck rattled over every bump in the road, and the girls swayed with it, synchronized like two small boats tied together in a harbor. Halfway to the hospital, Lily spoke without looking up. He broke the chair, the one Mama painted yellow. She painted it for us when we were little. It was our special chair. She painted sunflowers on it. He broke it against the wall. Colt's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She kept painting it. Lily continued, her voice flat, narrating trauma the way a weatherman narrates a forecast. Every time he broke something, she'd fix it. She fixed the cabinet door. She fixed the mirror in the hallway. She couldn't fix the chair this time because he broke it into too many pieces. The truck rolled past the Millhaven Water Tower, past the Baptist Church on the corner of 3rd and Magnolia, past the elementary school, where Wade Crenshaw had apparently donated enough money to get his name on a plaque by the front door. Rosie stirred beside her sister. She looked up at Colt with those old eyes. Are you scared of him? Colt considered the question seriously, the way you should always consider a child's question seriously, because children don't ask idle questions. Every question a child asks is an attempt to map the world to understand which parts of it are safe and which parts will hurt them. No, he said, I'm not scared of him. He should have left it there. But something in Rosie's face, the way she was measuring his answer against every lie every adult had ever told her, made him add the truth. I've been scared of plenty of things in my life. Being alone, growing old with nothing to show for it, dying in a room where nobody knows my name. But I stopped being scared of men like Wade Crenshaw a long time ago. Why? Because men like Wade Crenshaw are only big when they're standing next to someone small. You put them in a room with someone their own size and they shrink. Rosie seemed to think about this. Then she nodded a single small nod and pressed her face against her sister's shoulder. The bloody fabric was still in her hand. She hadn't let go of it once. Colt understood that too. Sometimes you hold on to the thing that hurts because letting go feels too much like giving up. At the hospital, they waited. Colt bought hot chocolate from the vending machine. It was terrible thin and vaguely chemical, The institutional approximation of comfort that exists only in hospitals and bus stations and other places where warmth is needed most and quality matters least. But the girls wrapped their small hands around the warm paper cups like they were holding something precious, something rare. A nurse gave Rosie a stuffed rabbit from a donation box in the pediatric ward. It was white with one floppy ear and a stitched smile that had seen better days. Rosie held it tight against her chest, right next to the bloody fabric, but she never took her eyes off the emergency room doors. She watched those doors with the patience and intensity of a soldier watching a perimeter. A child shouldn't know how to wait like that. A child shouldn't have the stillness of someone who has learned that waiting is a survival skill, that staying quiet and staying small and staying alert is how you make it from 1 hour to the next in a house where love and violence shared the same address. Lily was different. Lily fidgeted. She swung her legs. She counted the ceiling tiles. She asked Colt how old he was and whether he had a mom and what kind of truck he drove and whether the tattoos on his hands hurt when he got them. She asked questions the way a drowning person treads water, not out of curiosity, but out of a desperate need to keep moving, to keep the surface world visible, to avoid sinking into the silence where the fear lived. Colt answered every question. 61. Yes, a dog named Rebel, a Ford. And yeah, the tattoos hurt. Everything that matters hurts a little. Hours passed. Colt paced the waiting room back and forth across a linoleum floor that squeaked under his boots. The girls sat motionless in plastic chairs that were too big for them, their legs dangling above the floor. Nurses came and went, offering kind smiles and no information. Finally, a doctor came through the double doors, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and steady hands, and the particular expression of someone who has delivered bad news so many times that the delivery has become muscle memory, but the weight of it never gets lighter. Are you the family? Colt looked down at the two small girls pressed against his sides, one on his left, one on his right, their blonde heads barely reaching his elbows. Yeah, he said, we are. The doctor studied him. The tattoos, the leather vest, the size of him, the scar, the prison ink on his knuckles. She took all of it in with the quick professional assessment of someone trained to evaluate situations at a glance. Mrs. Prescott is in surgery. She has 3 broken ribs, one of which punctured her left lung, causing a partial collapse. There's internal bleeding we're working to control, severe concussion, multiple contusions and lacerations requiring closure. The doctor paused and lowered her voice, though not low enough that the girls couldn't hear. The injuries are consistent with a prolonged violent assault. This wasn't a fall down the stairs or a single incident. The bruising patterns suggest this has been ongoing for a significant period. We're required by law to report this to law enforcement. They've been called, Colt said. Good. The doctor looked at the girls and her professional composure slipped just enough to reveal the anger underneath. An anger she kept on a very short leash, but that Colt recognized because he kept the same anger on the same kind of leash inside his own chest. These two need to be somewhere safe tonight. They're with me, Colt said. Nobody's taking them anywhere. The doctor held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she nodded once, turned on her heel, and walked back through the double doors. At 2 in the morning, a detective showed up. Young guy, mid-30s maybe, with a neat tie and a notebook already open before he even sat down. His name was Newell, and he asked all the right questions in all the wrong ways. Clinical, detached, like he was filling out a form at the DMV instead of investigating a woman who'd been beaten half to death in her own living room. And your relationship to the victim. Mr. Drayton, I found her. The girls stated their stepfather, Wade Crenshaw, was responsible. Can you confirm that I can confirm what the girls told me and what I saw when I walked into that house? Newell scribbled something in his notebook. He did it slowly, deliberately, like a man who was running out the clock on a conversation he didn't want to be having. Wade Crenshaw is a well-known member of this community, donates to the Sheriff's Benevolent Fund, built the new computer lab at Eastside Elementary, coaches youth baseball. Are you certain that... I'm certain. Colt cut him off. His voice didn't rise, but something in the temperature of it dropped by several degrees. I'm certain that a woman is in surgery with 3 broken ribs and a collapsed lung, and that her 7-year-old daughters had to run barefoot through the streets to beg a stranger for help. That's what I'm certain of. Are you certain you want to sit there and tell me what a great guy Wade Crenshaw is? Newell's pen stopped moving. His jaw tightened. Something flashed across his eyes, gone too fast to identify. Guilt, maybe. or the absence of it. He closed his notebook with a soft snap that sounded like a door shutting. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Drayton." Colt watched him leave. He watched the way Newell walked, the slight hurry in his step, the way he didn't look back. The way a man walks when he's leaving a situation he doesn't want to be connected to. The way a man walks when the notebook in his pocket contains words he has no intention of ever reading again. Something cold and heavy settled in Colt's gut, a cold that didn't come from temperature but from understanding, from the slow, sickening realization that the machinery you thought existed to protect people actually exists to protect something else entirely. The detective hadn't asked for a physical description of Wade, hadn't put out a bolo or an APB or whatever they called it these days, hadn't typed a single thing into his phone, hadn't radioed dispatch, hadn't even seemed surprised. He'd asked Colt if he was certain, the way you ask someone if they're sure they want to file a complaint, the way you give someone one last chance to change their mind and make the whole thing go away quietly. He already knew. That was the truth of it. Newell already knew what Wade Crenshaw was. He'd probably known for years. And knowing hadn't changed a single thing. That's when Colt knew this wasn't just about one violent husband. Wade Crenshaw had protection, friends in places that mattered, connections that made evidence disappear, and reports get lost, and investigations die of natural causes on someone's desk. Power that doesn't need to threaten because it has already purchased silence at wholesale prices. Colt looked down at the twins. Lily had finally fallen asleep, her head resting against his arm, her mouth slightly open, her breathing deep and steady for the first time all night. Even in sleep, her hand still gripped the edge of his vest. Rosie was still awake, still staring at those emergency room doors with the stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest and the bloody fabric clutched in her other hand. Her eyes were too old for her face, eyes that had seen things that no 7-year-old should carry. "Rosie," Colt said softly. She looked up at him. "Has anyone ever tried to help your mama before?" Rosie's lip trembled, but she held it firm. The effort it cost her was visible in every muscle of her small face. She called the police once. Last year, she had a black eye and a broken finger. Wade told them she was crazy, that she hurt herself, that she drank too much and fell down the stairs. The police believed him. She hugged the rabbit tighter. He told us nobody would ever believe us, because he's important, and we're just kids. Colt felt something harden inside his chest. Not anger, something deeper than anger. Something with roots that went all the way down to the bedrock of who he was, past the violence and the prison time, and the decades of wasted years, down to whatever was left underneath all of it, down to the part of him that had survived everything else. "Rosie, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I believe you. I believe every single word, and I'm going to make sure other people believe you too." How, she asked, not with doubt, with genuine curiosity. The question of a child who has tried every door in a burning building and found them all locked and is now being told there's one more door she hasn't tried. "I don't know yet," Colt said honestly, "but I've been fighting my whole life. I just never had a good enough reason until now." Rosie stared at him for a long moment. Her blue eyes searched his face the same way her sisters had on the porch, looking for truth, looking for the thing underneath the words that tells you whether someone means what they say or is just filling the silence with sounds that feel good to make. Whatever she found, it was enough. She leaned her head against his arm right next to her sleeping sister and closed her eyes. The stuffed rabbit was pressed between them, its one floppy ear bent against Colt's leather vest. Colt sat there in that hospital waiting room, a former Hell's Angels enforcer with a violent past and a criminal record, and a face that frightened children on the street, holding 2 sleeping girls he'd met 4 hours ago. Girls whose mother had watched him from across a diner for 6 months and decided he was worth trusting with the only things in this world she cared about. Not the police, not the deputy with the badge, not the lawyers or the social workers or the courts. A battered woman had looked at every option available to her and landed on a 61-year-old biker with prison tattoos. And she'd been right. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He opened the message with one hand, careful not to shift his arm and wake the girls. 4 words on the screen. "Walk away, old man." Colt stared at the message. The glow from the screen illuminated his face in the dim waiting room. His jaw worked slowly, the muscles flexing beneath the scar on his left side. He typed back 2 words. "Make me." He put the phone in his pocket, pulled the girls a little closer, and settled in for the longest night of his life. The waiting room was nearly empty at this hour. A man in paint-stained overalls slept upright in a chair by the window, his head tilted back, mouth open, snoring softly. A woman in scrubs sat cross-legged on the floor by the vending machines, eating a granola bar and staring at nothing. The fluorescent lights buzzed with the tireless hum of a place that never fully sleeps and never fully wakes. Colt sat with his back against the wall, a position he had chosen by instinct. Never sit with your back to a door. Never sit where you can't see who's coming. Old habits, survival reflexes written into his nervous system with permanent ink. Lily shifted in her sleep, murmuring something Colt couldn't catch. Her small hand found the edge of his vest again and held on. In that moment, she looked nothing like a girl who had run through the streets covered in her mother's blood 4 hours ago. She looked like any sleeping child anywhere. Peaceful, trusting, completely surrendered to the care of the person beside her. Colt looked at her and felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. The weight of being needed. Not feared, not respected, not tolerated. Needed. It sat on his chest like a stone, and for reasons he couldn't explain, it was the first stone he'd ever carried that didn't make him want to set it down. He thought about his own life, the choices, the wreckage. 25 years in the Hells Angels, and what did he have to show for it? A house that was too quiet, a dog that was too old, a booth at a diner where he ate the same meal at the same time every day because routine was the only thing that kept the emptiness from becoming unbearable. He'd had a family once, a wife named Christine who'd loved him despite everything until the everything became too much. She'd left when the club business followed him home, and one too many times when the late-night phone calls and the bloody knuckles and the 3-day disappearances finally outweighed whatever it was she'd seen in him at the start. She'd packed one suitcase and walked out the front door on a Wednesday afternoon, while Colt was sitting in a bar 40 miles away, pretending that the world outside the clubhouse didn't exist. He never went after her. That was the part he couldn't forgive himself for. Not the violence, not the crimes, not the 4 year in a cell. The thing that woke him up at 3 in the morning, with a taste like copper in his mouth, was the fact that he'd let her walk away and hadn't even tried to follow. Now 2 girls he'd never met had grabbed his hands and pulled him off that booth and into their lives, and he'd followed without a second's hesitation. He'd done for strangers what he couldn't do for the people who'd loved him. He didn't know what to make of that. He wasn't sure he wanted to. But the message on his phone wasn't the only thing keeping him awake. His mind kept circling back to the house on Orchard Lane, the shattered kitchen, the bloody handprint on the refrigerator, the broken chair. All of that was terrible, but it was also familiar. He'd seen domestic violence before. He'd grown up in a house where his father's fists were the weather system that governed every day, where the forecast was always the same, partly violent with a chance of worse. What he couldn't stop thinking about were the things that didn't fit. The Cartier watch on a woman whose electricity had been shut off. The Louis Vuitton bag in a house with an empty refrigerator. Utilities shut-off notices stacked on the counter next to a crystal vase that was worth more than the counter itself. Wade Crenshaw wasn't just beating his wife. He was keeping her in a carefully constructed prison, one where the walls looked expensive from the outside and hollow from the inside, where the luxury items existed not for Marlene's benefit, but for the neighbors, so anyone who happened to glance through the window would see a woman who had nice things and therefore must have a nice life. The watch and the bag were camouflage. They were the costume a predator dressed his victim in so the world would see comfort instead of captivity. So the neighbors would say things like, well, she has a Cartier watch, how bad could it be? So the police would walk into that living room and see the nice things in the nice neighborhood and the nice man in the nice suit and decide that whatever happened here must have been a misunderstanding. Colt had known men like this in the club, not the loudmouth brawlers or the road-raging weekend warriors. The other kind, the quiet ones. The ones who wore their cruelty the way other men wore cologne, subtle enough that you couldn't point to it, pervasive enough that it seeped into everything. The ones who could shake your hand at a fundraiser and strangle the life out of something beautiful before bedtime. Wade Crenshaw wasn't a man who lost his temper. He was a man who used his temper the way a carpenter uses a hammer, with precision, with purpose, with the understanding that fear is the most efficient tool ever invented for keeping people in line. And then there were the girl's words echoing in his mind like footsteps in an empty hall. Mama told us to find you. She said his name is Mr. Colt. A woman he'd never met had studied him from a distance, had asked about him, had learned his name, his schedule, his seat in a diner, had prepared her 7-year-old daughters to find him, to describe him, to go straight to him when everything fell apart. This was not a woman who had given up. This was a woman who had been planning, quietly, carefully, for a long time. While her ribs healed and her bruises faded and her daughters watched her through doorways, with eyes that understood more than any child should. While the police didn't come, and the lawyers didn't call, and the neighbors didn't ask, she'd been building something, an escape route, a last resort, a plan that depended entirely on a man she'd never spoken to, which meant that whatever Colt had walked into today wasn't just a domestic violence case. It was the end result of something much bigger, something built over months or maybe years of calculated desperation. A last resort that had been designed and rehearsed and polished in the darkness of a life lived under siege. Marlene Prescott hadn't sent her daughters to find a stranger. She'd sent them to find the one man she'd chosen, the one man she believed could do what the police wouldn't, what the courts hadn't, what the neighbors refused to. The question that wouldn't let Colt rest, the question that turned over and over in his mind like a stone in a river, was this: what kind of woman, beaten to the edge of death alone, abandoned by every system built to protect her, still has the presence of mind to execute a plan? What kind of woman trains her children to be soldiers in her own rescue? What kind of woman, lying on the floor in her own blood, uses her last conscious breath not to cry or beg or curse, but to send a message to someone she wronged years ago? Tell her I never wanted this life. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell who Colt didn't have the answer yet. But he knew with the certainty of a man who had spent his whole life reading the hidden language beneath people's words that the answer to that question would change everything. Somewhere across town, Wade Crenshaw was running. But Millhaven was a small town, and Colt Drayton had learned a long time ago that small towns have nowhere to hide. Every road leads back to the same gas station. Every face shows up at the same diner. Every secret eventually finds its way to the surface because in a small town, secrets don't have enough room to stay buried. The hospital lights hummed overhead. The machines behind the surgery doors beeped their steady rhythm, each beep a heartbeat, a proof of life, a declaration that Marlene Prescott was still in this world and was not yet ready to leave it. And Colt sat perfectly still, a mountain of a man, guarding 2 sleeping children, his blue eyes fixed on the emergency room doors, waiting for whatever came next. He didn't know it yet, but what came next would be worse than anything he'd imagined. The violence, the threats, the men from his past showing up with chains and bats, all of that was coming. But so was something else. A truth about Wade Crenshaw so dark it would shake Millhaven to its foundation. A truth that a quiet woman with bruised arms had been carefully, methodically building toward for 2 years. A truth she'd hidden in a librarian's desk, in a box beneath her bed, in the practiced words of 2 little girls who loved her enough to run barefoot through the streets. And it all started with a dead man's life insurance policy and a signature that shouldn't have existed. 3 days passed before Marlene Prescott opened her eyes. 3 days of Colt sleeping upright in hospital chairs that were designed by someone who had never sat in a hospital chair. 3 days of driving the girls to Mrs. Opal Tanner's house each morning, his neighbor, a retired nurse in her 70s, with soft hands and a refrigerator full of casseroles and a steady, unshakable calm that only comes from decades of watching people survive things they shouldn't have survived. 3 days of buying terrible vending machine coffee and pacing the waiting room floor until the squeak of his boots on linoleum became a sound the night nurses could recognize from 3 hallways away. On the 4th morning, Colt walked into Marlene's room and found her sitting up. Her face was still swollen. The bruises had shifted from purple to that sickly yellow-green. That meant the healing had started, though the damage underneath would take much longer to fade than the colors on her skin. A row of stitches ran above her right eyebrow like a dark seam in a piece of cloth that had been torn and put back together by someone in a hurry. Her left arm was wrapped in a compression bandage. The hospital gown hung loose on her thin frame, and the bones of her collarbones pressed against the fabric like the framework of something that had been stripped of everything except its structure. But her eyes were open, and they were clear. And when she looked at Colt standing in the doorway, filling the entire frame with his shoulders and his leather vest and the white bandage on his forehead, where the stitches from a later night would eventually go, She didn't look surprised. She looked like someone who had been waiting. "You're still here," she said. Her voice was raw, scraped thin, the voice of someone whose throat had spent 3 days with a tube down it. "Told you I would be. I thought I dreamed you." She tried to smile, but her split lip cracked and she winced, and the smile turned into something else. Something halfway between pain and relief. Big man in a leather vest sitting by my bed. Figured the morphine was being creative. Colt pulled the chair closer and sat down. The chair groaned under his weight. Everything groaned under his weight. He'd made peace with that a long time ago. "Your girls are safe. They're staying with my neighbor, Mrs. Tanner. Retired nurse, 73 years old, makes grilled cheese sandwiches that could win a state fair ribbon and reads to them every night before bed. They're okay, Marlene. They're eating. They're sleeping. They ask about you every hour." She closed her eyes and 2 tears rolled down her bruised cheeks, tracing careful paths around the swelling, finding the lowest ground the way water always does. She didn't wipe them away. She let them fall. "He'll come back for them. You don't know him. He doesn't let go of things he thinks belong to him. He's not getting near them." "You don't understand." Her voice broke on the word understand, cracking down the middle like a dry branch. "He owns this town. The sheriff plays golf with him every Saturday at the Millhaven Country Club. Half the police department has done contract work for his construction company. The city council gave him an award last year for community service." Community service. She said the words like they were made of broken glass. "When I called the police last year, they came to the house. They looked at my face. They looked at Wade in his nice shirt with his nice handshake. And they asked me if I'd been drinking." Colt leaned forward, his forearms on his knees, his scarred hands hanging between them. He let her talk. "Sometimes the most important thing a man can do is close his mouth and open his ears and let someone say the things they've been holding behind their teeth for years. Marlene, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." She met his eyes. Whatever she saw in them, it was enough. "Your first husband, Martin, how did he die?" The change in her face was immediate. The fear that had been living behind her eyes since the moment she woke up shifted into something deeper, something older, something that looked like grief that had been soaked in guilt and left to ferment in the dark for 8 years. She turned her head away from him. She looked at the wall, at the window, at anything that wasn't his face. "Hunting accident," she said, flat, rehearsed. "The way you say something you've said so many times it's lost all connection to meaning. That's what the report said. That's what everyone said. But that's not what you believe." Silence. "What, bar, Mum?" The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Down the hall, a cart rattled Martin's. Somewhere a phone rang and nobody answered it. Martin didn't hunt. Marlene finally said, the words came out like they'd been locked in a vault and someone had finally turned the key. He'd never held a rifle in his life. He was a CP, a Colt, a certified public accountant. He did people's taxes and coached the girls' t-ball team and made pancakes on Saturday mornings shaped like animals. He called the elephant ones Ella cakes. The girls thought that was the funniest word in the English language. Her hands twisted the hospital blanket into knots, wringing the thin cotton, the way you wring a washcloth, the way you wring your hands when the thing you need to say is bigger than your mouth. But Wade convinced him to go. Boys' weekend, he called it, hunting trip up in the mountains. They'd only known each other 2 months. 2 months. And Martin said yes, because Martin always said yes. Because Martin believed that people were good and that kindness was the default setting of the human heart, and that a man who brings your wife flowers and plays with your daughters on the living room floor couldn't possibly be the kind of man who would hurt you. She paused, drew a breath that cost her 3 broken ribs worth of pain. And Martin came back in a body bag, accidental discharge. Wade was the only witness. The investigation lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks, and then case closed, and then a funeral, and then a hole in the world where my husband used to stand. Colt's jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck stood out like ropes. How long after the funeral before Wade came around? 6 weeks. Her laugh was bitter and hollow, a sound with no joy in it at all. The laugh of someone who has replayed a moment so many times they've worn through the tape. 6 weeks. And he was at my door with flowers and a casserole telling me he felt responsible, telling me he wanted to help. That Martin would have wanted him to look after us. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. I was drowning Colt. 2 baby girls 6 months old, a mortgage I couldn't make alone, funeral costs. Martin's life insurance hadn't come through yet, and the bank was calling every day, and the bills were piling up, and I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't eat, and I couldn't breathe. And there was Wade, so kind, so attentive, so ready to take care of everything. The life insurance. Colt said it carefully like he was handling something fragile. How much Marlene met his eyes. $1.2 million. Martin was careful, meticulous. He wanted the girls taken care of no matter what happened to him. He set up the policy 6 months after they were born, said it was the responsible thing to do. And where's that money now? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The empty refrigerator, the shut-off notices, the luxury items that existed for decoration, not for use. The answer was written in every detail of her life. She looked at Colt for a long time, and then she said something that changed the shape of everything. I know what you found in the house. Colt went still. I know you found the box under the tent. The girls told Mrs. Tanner and Mrs. Tanner told you. I know you found the letter from Morrison and Associates. I know you've been asking questions around town. Helen Jessup called me yesterday from the hospital lobby. She pushed herself higher against the pillows. The effort made her face go white, but she did it anyway. You think you've been investigating. You think you've been uncovering things. Marlene's voice was steady now, stronger than it had been since she woke up. Steadier than a woman with 3 broken ribs and a collapsed lung had any right to sound. But I need you to understand something, Colt. Everything you found I put there for you to find. The room went quiet. The heart monitor beeped. The air conditioning hummed. Colt sat in his chair and felt the ground shift beneath him, not literally, but in the way the ground shifts when you realize that the story you've been telling yourself is not the story that's actually happening. What do you mean? Marlene reached under her pillow and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it out to him. Her hand trembled, but her eyes didn't waver. Colt took the paper and unfolded it. It was a list, handwritten in small, precise letters, numbered, organized. The handwriting of a woman who had spent a long time thinking about every word. 2 years ago, Marlene said I found a newspaper clipping in Wade's desk drawer. I was looking for stamps. The clipping was about a woman named Sandra Bolin who disappeared from Mercer County 9 years ago. The article said she'd recently come into an inheritance. The article said she'd been dating a local businessman. There was no photo of the man, but the description matched Wade perfectly. She paused, swallowed. Wade caught me reading it. He slapped me so hard I saw double for an hour. Told me if I ever touched his things again, the girls would pay for it. Not me, the girls. Her voice didn't break this time. It held, like a beam that's been tested to its limit and discovered it can carry more than anyone expected. But I'd already read enough. And that night, lying in bed with an ice pack on my face and Wade snoring beside me like the world was a perfectly safe place, I decided I was done being afraid. Not done being hit. I knew the hitting wouldn't stop, but done letting the fear make my decisions. She pointed at the paper in Colt's hands. That list is everything I did over the next 2 years. Every document I copied, every account number I memorized, every file I photographed with a phone Wade didn't know I had a prepaid phone I bought with cash at a gas station in Henderson. I kept it taped behind the toilet tank. Only took it out when he was at Sullivan's Tavern. He went every night 6 to 10, like clockwork. Creatures of habit are easy to work around when you're patient enough. Colt looked down at the list. 37 items, bank statements, property deeds, shell company registrations, power of attorney documents, insurance policies, each one noted with a date and a location. Each one copied and delivered to a single destination. Helen Jessup, the librarian. Marlene nodded. Helen's been my friend since high school, the only friend Wade couldn't cut me off from because he never knew about her. I gave her everything. Every copy, every photo, every document. She put it all on a flash drive and kept it in her desk at the library. 6 months of records. Everything Wade thought was hidden, I found. Everything he thought was safe, I copied. Colt read the list again. His hands were steady, but something behind his ribs was not. Item number 31 caught his eye. Observe C. Drayton at Wanda's roadside grill. Daily routine confirmed. Noon arrival. Same booth. Left side rear. Physical description recorded. Background verified through W. Fitz. You watched me for 6 months. I needed to know who you were. I couldn't ask directly, couldn't risk Wade finding out I was talking to anyone, let alone a man. So I watched you through the window when I walked the girls to school. Wanda's is on the route. I started going in for coffee once a week, always when you were there, always sitting where I could see you without you seeing me. Why me? Because I tried everything else first. She counted off on her bruised fingers. I called the domestic violence hotline 3 years ago. Wade found the number in my call history. He broke two of my fingers and told me next time it would be the girl's fingers. I went to a lawyer, Morrison, 2.5 years ago. Wade found out within a week. Morrison dropped my case overnight. No explanation, no call, just gone. I tried the police. You know how that went. I tried the church. Father Sharp was kind, but kind doesn't stop a fist. I tried to leave once, packed a bag in the middle of the night. Wade was waiting in the truck at the end of the driveway. He didn't say a word. He just sat there in the dark, engine off, headlights off, watching. I went back inside and unpacked the bag, and he never mentioned it. She took a breath. It cost her. Every door was locked. Every window was painted shut. Every road out of that house ran through Wade or someone Wade controlled. So I stopped looking for doors and started building my own. And I was the door. You were the battering ram. Marlene almost smiled. I needed someone Wade couldn't buy, couldn't scare, couldn't control. Someone outside his network. Someone strong enough to walk into that house and not walk out until something changed. I asked Wanda about you one morning when the diner was empty. She told me you were ex-hellsangels, that you'd done time, that you were a man people crossed the street to avoid. And then she said something that made my decision for me. What did she say? She said he tips 20%, remembers my birthday, and once carried a stray cat 6 blocks to the vet in the rain. The man's not what he looks like. Colt said nothing. I trained the girls. Marlene continued. 3 months of practice. Every night after Wade fell asleep, I'd sit on the edge of their bed and we'd go through it. What's his name, Mr. Colt? What does he look like? Very big tattoos on his hands, blue eyes, leather vest. Where does he sit? Asked Booth on the left. What do you say when you find him? They beat our mom. You have to help. I made them repeat it until they could say it in their sleep. Because I knew that when the time came, they'd be terrified, and terrified children forget everything except what's been drilled into their bones. Colt looked at this woman, this thin, bruised woman in a hospital gown sitting up against pillows in a room that smelled like antiseptic and institutional soap. This woman who had spent 2 years building an escape route out of stolen documents and memorized account numbers in a 6-month surveillance operation conducted through a diner window. This woman who had trained her 7-year-old daughters the way you train soldiers for an extraction, with repetition and precision, and the grim understanding that when the moment comes, there is no room for error. He had walked into that house thinking he was rescuing a helpless woman. He was beginning to understand that Marlene Prescott had never been helpless. She had been trapped, isolated, beaten, controlled, but she had never, not for a single day, stopped fighting. She had simply learned to fight in the only way available to her. Silently, invisibly, with the patience of someone who knows that the walls of a prison can only be dismantled one brick at a time. The list, Colt said. Item 29, metal lockbox, under floorboard, living room, northeast corner. Brass key on ring and center console, Wade's truck silver horseshoe keychain. Marlene nodded. That box is Wade's insurance policy. His records. He thinks nobody knows about it, but I watched him through the bedroom door one night. He was on his knees by the fireplace, pulling up the floorboard, putting papers inside. Bank statements, property deeds, and something else. Something I couldn't see clearly, but he handled it like it was the most important thing he owned. Colt leaned back. He already had the brass key in his pocket. He'd taken it from Wade's truck at Sullivan's 2 nights ago. He'd already opened the box. He'd already seen what was inside. He pulled out his phone and showed Marlene the photos he'd taken. Every document, every page, every signature. Her eyes moved across the screen. She recognized the bank statements, the shell companies, the property deeds. Her expression shifted from recognition to confusion to something that looked like the blood draining from a face that didn't have much color left to lose. What is that? She pointed at one of the photos, a document she hadn't seen before, a document that wasn't on her list, that Colt said is a life insurance policy for Sandra Bolin, purchased 10 years ago, 14 months before she disappeared. The beneficiary isn't Sandra's family. It isn't her parents or her children. The beneficiary is Piedmont Capital Group. Marlene stared at him. Piedmont Capital Group is one of Wade's shell companies, the same one that received the transfers from your accounts from Martin's pension from the girls' trust fund. Wade took out a life insurance policy on a woman he was dating, listed his own fake company as the beneficiary, and 14 months later, that woman vanished off the face of the earth. The color left Marlene's face entirely. She looked like a woman who had just opened a door she thought she understood and found that it led to a room much larger and much darker than anything she'd imagined. You think he killed her? I think Sandra Boland was the first. The trial run. I think Wade learned how to do it with Sandra, and then he did it again with Martin. He didn't kill Martin to get to Martin. He killed Martin to get to you, to get to the insurance money, to get to the life he could build on top of your grief. Sandra then, Martin, then you. 3 targets, same pattern, same man. Colt watched her face as the pieces connected. He could almost see it happening behind her eyes, the way you can see weather moving across a landscape from a distance. Every strange moment from the past 8 years rearranging itself around this new understanding. Every time Wade had been too generous, too attentive, too quick to take control. Every time he'd insisted she cut ties with someone, fire a lawyer, stop asking questions. Every smile that had felt slightly wrong like a painting hung 1 degree off center. She pressed both hands over her mouth. Her whole body trembled. The heart monitor beside her bed began to beat faster, the rhythm accelerating like a drum, being played by increasingly panicked hands. Colt gave her a moment. Some truths need space to land. They need time to settle into the bones before the mind can begin to process them. When her breathing steadied, she lowered her hands. Her eyes were different now. The fear was still there, but it had company. Something harder. Something that looked like the moment a cornered animal stops running and turns around. "Tell me what to do," she said. Colt shook his head. "I'm not going to tell you what to do. You've been told what to do for 8 years. What I am going to do is exactly what you planned for me to do. I'm going to take every piece of evidence you gathered, every document, every photo, and every record on that flash drive, and I'm going to put it in the hands of someone who can't be bought. Not the local police, not the local anything. The state police. The FBI, if I have to. And I know someone who can make the call. Father Leland Sharp, retired Army chaplain, 30 years of service and a Bronze Star. When a man like that picks up the phone and tells law enforcement that children are in danger, people listen." Marlene's eyes sharpened. Wade has friends everywhere. Wade has friends in Millhaven. The state police don't play golf with him on Saturday. The FBI doesn't take his donations. This goes beyond his reach, or it doesn't go at all. She nodded slowly. Then she began to talk. Not in fragments anymore, not in the careful, rationed sentences of a woman afraid of saying too much. She talked the way a general talks when the battle map is finally spread out on the table and the pieces are finally in position. She told Colt about Wade's habits, which nights he drank at Sullivan's and which nights he stayed home, which sheriff's deputies were on his payroll and which ones were simply afraid, which local judge owed him favors and which state judges were clean. She drew the map of Wade's network from memory, every connection, every debt, every pressure point, a web she had spent 8 years mapping from the inside while Wade thought she was too broken to pay attention. She told him about Dorothy Prescott, Martin's mother, the woman she'd cut out of her life 8 years ago at Wade's insistence. The woman who had gotten down on her knees in Marlene's kitchen and begged her not to marry Wade Crenshaw. "I told her she was a bitter old woman who couldn't let go of her dead son," Marlene said, and the words came out coated in a shame that time doesn't soften. "I said terrible things. She was right about everything, and I said terrible things to her, and I haven't spoken to her since. Tell her," that's what Marlene had whispered on the living room floor. "Tell her I never wanted this life. Tell her I'm sorry." Dorothy Prescott, a woman in her 70s who had spent 8 years knowing in her bones that her son had been murdered and that nobody believed her. Marlene also told Colt something he hadn't expected. Dorothy had been investigating on her own for 8 years. A retired woman in a small town going through public records, collecting newspaper clippings, writing letters to the state attorney general's office that were never answered. And she'd found something. A receipt for a rifle Wade had purchased 2 weeks before the hunting trip that killed Martin. Martin didn't own a gun, Marlene said. The gun that killed him was Wade's, and Wade bought it 14 days before they went into those woods. She gave Colt Dorothy's address. Willow Creek Road, a farmhouse outside the town limits. I erased that address from every record Wade could access 3 years ago, Marlene said. Changed it in the church directory, removed it from the phone book, made sure there was no paper trail connecting Dorothy to me or to the girls. She paused. Wade doesn't know where Dorothy lives. That was the one thing I made sure of, because if everything else failed, if I couldn't get out, if something happened to me, I needed one place in the world where my girls could go that Wade couldn't follow. Colt sat in that hospital room and looked at Marlene Prescott and saw her clearly for the first time. Not a victim, not a woman who had been beaten into submission. A woman who had been beaten into strategy, who had converted every blow into intelligence, every bruise into motivation, every sleepless night into planning time. She had built an invisible fortress around her children, using nothing but patience and memory, and a will that 8 years of violence had failed to break. He thought about the moment in the diner. Two little girls, barefoot, covered in blood, executing a plan their mother had designed from inside a prison that looked like a house, every detail accounted for. The diner, the booth, the man, the words, even the time of day, because Marlene knew Colt would be at Wanda's at noon, the same way she knew Wade would be at Sullivan's at 6. She had mapped both men's routines and used one to defeat the other. It was Colt realized the most courageous thing he'd ever witnessed. Not a single act of bravery, not a moment of heroism, something much harder. 2 years of invisible, methodical, exhausting courage performed in total silence, under constant threat, with no guarantee that any of it would work. The courage of a woman who couldn't run, couldn't fight, couldn't scream, and so instead learned to think her way through walls. That evening, Colt drove to the Cedar Falls Public Library. Helen Jessup was shelving books in the reference section when she saw him coming down the aisle. She was a small woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the sharp, watchful eyes of someone who has been keeping a dangerous secret for a long time. Not here, she whispered, looking past him toward the front desk where a young volunteer was checking in returns. Staff room, back hallway, second door on the left. In the cramped staff office, Helen locked the door, turned around, and pulled a flash drive from the pocket of her cardigan. Her hands were shaking. Marlene called me. She told me to give you everything. 6 months of documents. Bank statements, property transfers, forged signatures on power of attorney paperwork that Marlene swears she never signed. The girls' trust fund, Martin's pension, the insurance payout, and all of it funneled through shell companies into accounts Marlene couldn't touch. Colt took the drive. I've been carrying this for 6 months, Helen said. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I was too scared to go to the police. After what happened when Marlene tried, I didn't trust anyone. But I kept the records because Marlene told me to. She said someday someone would come for them. She said I'd know who it was when I saw him. She looked at Colt, at the tattoos and the vest and the scar, and she almost smiled. I know who you are. That night, Colt sat in his truck across the street from Sullivan's Tavern, watching Wade Crenshaw's black Mercedes through the bar window. The after-work crowd had filled the place, and Wade was doing what Wade did best: buying rounds, slapping backs, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, being everybody's best friend. At 7:15, Wade stepped outside to take a phone call. Colt watched him pace the parking lot, his face tight, his gestures sharp, his free hand cutting the air like a blade. Whatever the conversation was, it wasn't friendly. Wade ended the call by throwing his phone against the side of the building. He stood there for a moment, breathing hard, fists clenched, the veins in his neck visible, even from across the street. Then he picked up the phone, straightened his tie, smoothed his hair, and walked back inside with that polished smile locked firmly in place. The switch was instant, like flipping a light switch. 1 second, a man on the edge of explosion. The next, everybody's favorite neighbor. Colt had known men like this in the club. Psychopaths who could shake your hand over dinner and open your throat by dessert. The smile was the mask. The rage was the real face. And the speed of the transition, the ease of it, that was the tell. Normal people can't switch that fast. Normal people carry their emotions like luggage, visible, awkward, impossible to hide. Men like Wade carry their emotions like concealed weapons. You never see them until it's too late. At 9:40, Colt retrieved the documents from the lockbox under the floorboards at the Orchard Lane house, photographing every page. On his way out, a man was leaning against Colt's truck in the dark. Rattler McKee, wiry, mean-eyed, a knife on his belt, and a message from Wade in his mouth. Colt didn't wait for the message. He put Rattler on the ground with one short, clean hit to the ribs that left the man gasping in the gravel. No words exchanged. None needed. Then he called Wade's phone from the side of Route 12. The conversation was short. Wade threatened. Cameras in the house. Fabricated witnesses. A judge who would sign custody papers by Friday. Friends. Mutual friends, men from the motorcycle world who would make Colt understand the cost of interference. Colt listened. Then he listed what he'd found. The lockbox. Sandra Boland's insurance policy. Martin's paperwork with Wade's signature dated 4 months before a dead man stopped breathing. The shell companies, the forged documents, all of it. Silence on the other end. The first real silence Colt had heard from Wade Crenshaw. The silence of a man who has just realized that the walls he built to protect himself have been mapped by someone standing inside them. Here's what's going to happen, Colt said. I'm taking everything to the state police, not the local boys you've got in your pocket. And you're going to spend the rest of your life in a cell where nobody cares how much money you donate or how nice your suit is. Wade's voice came back. The smoothness was gone. What replaced it was something raw, something animal, something that lived beneath the country club's smile like a snake beneath a rock. You have no idea what you've done, old man. No idea what I'm capable of. I've been Hell's Angels for 25 years, Wade. I know exactly what men like you are capable of. The difference is I've stopped being afraid of it. The line went dead. Colt sat in his truck with his heart hammering against his ribs. He had just declared war on a man who may have killed 3 people and gotten away with it. A man with money connections and a violent streak that hid behind a charity gala smile. He reached for his phone and called Father Leland Sharp. The old chaplain answered on the second ring. His voice was calm, measured the voice of a man who had spent 30 years in the United States Army, ministering to soldiers in places where calm was the most valuable resource available. Colt told him everything. When he finished, Father Sharp was quiet for 10 seconds. Then he said, "What do you need from me? When I give the word, I need you to call the state police, the FB, a tip line in the Channel 7 news desk in Raleigh. All of them. Fast. The news desk, hard to bury a story when the cameras are already rolling." Father Sharp allowed himself a thin sound that might have been a smile. "I may be a man of God at Colt, but I was Army first. You don't win wars by being polite." That night, Colt's phone buzzed at 8:45. Unknown number. A text. "He's sending men tonight. 4 of them, 2 cars. They're coming for the girls. My source says midnight or after. He wants the girls as leverage." Colt typed back. "Who is this?" 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. "Helen, Lyle Poole came into the library today. Drunk, terrified, he lost $40,000 in one of Wade's investment schemes. Wade's been threatening him for months. He told me everything. Wade is planning to grab the girls, take them to a property he owns 2 counties over, and use them to force you to hand over the documents. After that, he's disappearing. He's been liquidating assets all week, selling properties, closing accounts. He knows it's over." Colt stared at the screen. His vision narrowed. The world contracted to a single point. 2 little girls asleep in his spare bedroom. A man with money and desperation and nothing left to lose, sending 4 men to take them in the middle of the night. He called Marlene. She answered on the first ring. She hadn't been sleeping either. Her voice was clear, alert, ready, as if she'd been waiting for this exact call her entire life. "I know," she said before he could speak. "Helen called me 10 minutes ago. Listen to me carefully. Do exactly what I tell you." And then Marlene Prescott, lying in a hospital bed with 3 broken ribs, and a tube in her arm, and bruises that mapped 8 years of hell across her skin, gave Colt Drayton his orders. "Don't move them just once. Wade always sends people to the obvious place first, then checks the backup location. He's methodical about it. He clears the primary target, then moves to the secondary. It's how he thinks. So where do I take them? First to Shelby's house on Elm Street. Let them be seen there. Let the neighbors see the lights. Then 1 hour later, move them again. Take them to Dorothy Prescott's farm on Willow Creek Road. Wade doesn't have that address. I erased it from every record he could access 3 years ago. Every phone book, every church directory, every mailing list. Dorothy's farm is the one place in Millhaven that Wade Crenshaw cannot find. And if he finds Shelby's house, Shelby knows. I called her after Helen called me. My sister's packing a bag right now. When the time comes, she drives the girls and Mrs. Tanner straight to the state police barracks in Henderson. No stops, no detours. She knows the rope. Colt stood in his hallway, phone pressed to his ear, looking at the closed door of the spare bedroom where Lily and Rosie slept. He could hear them breathing through the thin wood. The sound was quiet and rhythmic and trusting. The sound of children who believed they were safe because a man they'd met 4 days ago had promised they would be. "Marlene," he said, "I know what you're going to say." Her voice softened. "You're going to say this is dangerous. You're going to say the girls could get hurt. You're going to say we should wait for the state police. All of that is true, and all of it takes too long. If Wade gets the girls across county lines, he has leverage. If he has leverage, he negotiates. And Wade Crenshaw is very good at negotiating. He'll trade the girls for the documents. He'll trade the documents for time. He'll trade time for distance. And then he'll disappear and start over somewhere else with someone else and do this all over again." She took a breath that he could hear rattle against her broken ribs. "I did not spend 2 years building this plan to watch that man walk away. And I did not train my daughters to be brave so they could be used as bargaining chips by a man who murdered their father. End this tonight, Colt. End it." He moved fast after that, woke the girls gently, explained nothing because 7-year-olds don't need tactical briefings. They need steady hands and calm voices and the assurance that the adults in their lives have things under control. Drove them to Shelby's house on Elm Street, left the porch light on, made it visible. Then 1 hour later, exactly as Marlene had directed, moved them again. The girls and Mrs. Tanner and Shelby, all of them to Dorothy Prescott's farm. Dorothy was waiting on the porch when they arrived. A small, silver-haired woman in her 70s standing in a bathrobe and slippers with her porch light off and a shotgun leaning against the doorframe. She had Martin's kind eyes and a jaw set in a line that could have been carved from Appalachian granite. The look on her face was one Colt recognized. Not fear, resolution. The look of a woman who had been preparing for this night for 8 years. She didn't say a word when the girls came up the porch steps half asleep and confused Lily clutching Colt's jacket hem and Rosie holding her stuffed rabbit against her chest. Dorothy knelt down slowly, her arthritic knees protesting, and opened her arms. The girls didn't know her. They'd never met her. But something in the way she held them, the same way their mother held them, with the same fierce tenderness, the same determination to absorb the world's cruelty before it could reach them, made both girls lean in. She ushered them inside. Shelby followed with Mrs. Tanner. The screen door closed with a soft click. Dorothy put her hand on Colt's arm as he turned to leave. Her grip was stronger than a woman her age had any right to possess. "Bring him down," she said. Her voice was quiet but absolute. A voice that had spent 8 years whispering prayers for justice into the dark ceilings of an empty farmhouse. For Martin. For those girls. For Marlene. For Sandra Boland, wherever she is. Bring him down. He went back to his own house on Pimmon Road and waited. At 11:40, a dark sedan rolled past with its headlights off. It passed, the house paused, turned around, and passed again. At 11:50, a black SUV appeared, also running dark. It parked 3 houses down. 2 men got out. Colt recognized the walk of one of them, Rattler McKee favoring his right side from a previous encounter. A second sedan came, 4 men total, just like Helen said. They converged on his house. The front door held for 3 seconds before someone's boot caved it in. They were inside for 2 minutes. Then they came out. Acted, confused. Rattler was on his phone gesturing wildly. "They're not here," Colt heard him say. "House is empty. Old man's truck isn't here either." Then Rattler made another call, shorter. When he hung up, his posture changed. New orders. All 4 men got back in their vehicles and pulled out fast, heading east toward Elm Street. Colt's chest went cold. They knew about Shelby's. Someone had seen something, told someone, and the information had traveled to Wade within the hour. But Shelby's house was empty too, because Marlene had known, Because Marlene had planned for exactly this. Because a woman in a hospital bed with broken ribs had outmaneuvered a man with 4 hired thugs and a lifetime of getting what he wanted. Colt floored the truck, called Shelby. Phone rang twice. "We're out," Shelby said, "heading to Henderson. Girls are scared but safe. Mrs. Tanner's driving. Dorothy is with us." Then he called Father Sharp. 2 words. "Now." He heard Rattler's voice through the open window of the SUV as it idled near Shelby's empty house. "Forget the hospital. Wade says the mill. Regroup at the mill, the Piedmont Textile Mill, the old abandoned factory on Route 58 that Wade's construction company had purchased 3 years ago for reasons that nobody in town had ever questioned. Because nobody in town questioned Wade Crenshaw about anything. Father Sharp called back. State police dispatched. News crew from Raleigh alerted. ETA 45 minutes. 45 minutes was too long. Wade would be gone by then. Vanished into the dark with a bag of cash and a set of fake IDs in the knowledge that somewhere in the world there was always another small town with another lonely widow and another insurance policy waiting to be exploited. Colt couldn't let that happen. Not after everything Marlene had built. Not after 2 years of documents hidden in librarians' desks and escape routes memorized in the dark. Not after 2 little girls had practiced their mother's plan until they could recite it in their sleep. Not after a woman with broken ribs had orchestrated a counterstrike from a hospital bed that outmaneuvered a man who thought he controlled everything and everyone. If Wade disappeared tonight, Marlene's 2 years of silent warfare would mean nothing. Sandra Boland would stay buried in an unmarked grave. Martin Prescott's death would stay an accident. And somewhere in some other small town, some other woman would answer her door and find a man with flowers and a casserole and a smile that hid a predator's calculation. Colt pointed his truck east on Route 58. The engine rattled and coughed. The cracked windshield caught the moonlight and scattered it into a web of silver lines across his field of vision. The road was empty, the kind of empty that only exists in rural Carolina after midnight, when the world contracts to a tunnel of headlight beams and everything beyond the light ceases to exist. And on the seat beside him in the glove box he hadn't opened in 20 years, sat a .38 Special wrapped in oilcloth. Heavy, patient, full of the old life's solutions to the old life's problems. He didn't reach for it, not yet, but knowing it was there, knowing that the last tool of the man he used to be was still within arm's reach, if the man he was trying to become required it, that mattered. Not as comfort, as acknowledgement. An honest reckoning with the fact that the line between who he had been and who he wanted to be was thinner than he liked to admit, and that tonight he would walk that line in the dark with the fate of 2 children and one extraordinary woman resting on which side he came down on. The mill rose out of the darkness ahead. 3 stories of dead brick and shattered windows, a monument to an industry that had built this town and then abandoned it the way powerful things always eventually abandon the places they've used up. And somewhere inside it, a man who had built his entire life on the bodies of the people who trusted him was running out of room to run. Colt killed his headlights a quarter-mile from the Piedmont Textile Mill and coasted in behind a cluster of overgrown boxwoods that had been swallowing the parking lot fence for the better part of a decade. The engine ticked as it cooled. The night pressed against the windshield like a hand held flat against glass. Wade's black Mercedes was parked near the main entrance. The SUV sat beside it, engine still warm, the faint shimmer of heat rising from its hood visible in the moonlight. And behind both vehicles, half hidden in the shadow of a loading dock, a white van with no plates. A van that existed for one purpose: to move things that aren't supposed to be moved. People, evidence, bodies. Colt sat in the dark and opened the glove box. The .38 Special lay in its oilcloth, wrapping heavy and patient like an old friend who had been waiting 20 years for this conversation. He picked it up. The weight of it settled into his palm with the terrible familiarity of something the body remembers even when the mind has tried to forget. His hand knew the shape. His fingers knew the curve of the trigger guard, the cold kiss of the cylinder, the balance point where steel meets in tension. He checked the cylinder. 6 rounds. He'd loaded it 20 years ago and never unloaded it the way some men keep a packed suitcase by the door, not because they plan to leave, but because the option to leave is what keeps them sane. He tucked the gun into his waistband, stepped out of the truck, and moved toward the mill. The old skills came back like breathing. How to place his feet so gravel didn't crunch. How to use the shadows the way a swimmer uses currents, letting the darkness carry him rather than fighting through it. How to control his breathing so it made no more sound than the breeze moving through the broken windows above. 25 years of living outside the law had given him a particular education. An education in silence and violence, and the thin electric space between the two. Tonight he was going to use every lesson. The main entrance was unguarded, careless. Wade was panicking now, improvising, making decisions with the frantic energy of a man who has spent his entire life controlling every variable and has suddenly discovered that the variables have begun to control him. Inside the mill was a cathedral of decay, brick walls sweating moisture, rusted machinery frozen mid-function like metal skeletons caught in the act of dying. The floor was a mosaic of broken glass and pigeon droppings and the accumulated silence of 30 years of abandonment. Voices echoed from the second floor. Colt counted 3, Wade, Rattler McKee, and someone he didn't recognize. A third voice, calm, professional, flat in a way that human voices aren't supposed to be flat, like someone had taken an ordinary voice and sanded off every edge that might indicate emotion or conscience or the basic human capacity to care about consequences. He moved up the metal staircase, testing each step before committing his weight. The stairs groaned softly under 260 pounds of careful intention. The second floor was a maze of old offices and storage rooms, most of the doors hanging open, like mouths frozen mid-scream. At the end of the corridor, light spilled from a doorway. White light battery powered the harsh, sterile glow of a lantern designed for camping trips and power outages, and late-night operations in places where the electricity was cut because the building was supposed to be empty. Colt pressed himself against the wall and listened. "The girls are gone," Rattler was saying, his voice tight with the particular frustration of a man who has failed at a simple task and knows the penalty for failure. The old man moved them. "We hit the house and it was empty. We hit the sister's place on Elm Street. Empty too. I don't know where they are. I don't care about the girls anymore." Wade's voice had changed. Gone was the smooth baritone, the Chamber of Commerce charm, the carefully modulated warmth that had fooled an entire town for a decade. What replaced it was something high, wild, ragged at the edges. The voice of a man whose mask had finally cracked all the way through, and what was underneath was not something anyone would want to look at directly. "I need the documents. He has copies. He has everything. If those documents reach the state police, I'm finished. Life in prison. Maybe worse. Then we find him and we take them back." The third voice, the professional, each word delivered with the precision of a scalpel laid on a tray. No inflection, no hurry. The voice of someone for whom violence was not an act of passion, but a line item on an invoice. "He's probably already turned them over," Rattler said. "Then we make him tell us who he gave them to." The professional paused. "And then we make sure he can't testify." "That's what you're paying me for, Wade. Let me do my job." Colt's stomach tightened. This wasn't just Rattler and a couple of bar brawlers anymore. Wade had brought in a specialist, someone whose professional vocabulary included phrases like, "make sure he can't testify," delivered with the same casual competence a plumber might use to describe fixing a leak. He pulled out his phone and sent one text to Father Sharp. 3 men in the mill, second floor, 1 professional armed, tell state police to come heavy. Then he did something that went against every survival instinct he'd developed in 25 years with the Hells Angels. Every rule of engagement he'd learned in bar fights and ambushes, and the long, violent education of a life spent among men who settled their differences with chains and tire irons and the occasional bullet. He stepped into the doorway. All 3 men spun toward him. Rattler's hand went to his belt, where the outline of a knife handle pressed against the fabric of his jacket. The professional, a man Colt had never seen before, leaned late 40s with the flat, expressionless eyes of someone who had crossed a line so long ago, he could no longer see it in his rearview mirror, reached behind his back, with the smooth, practiced motion of a man reaching for his wallet, except what he kept behind his back wasn't a wallet. "I wouldn't," Colt said. His voice filled the room the way concrete fills a mold. Heavy, final, leaving no space for argument or air. "State police are 20 minutes out. News crew from Raleigh right behind them. Whatever you're reaching for behind your back won't help you." It'll just add to the charges. Wade's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Shock because Colt was supposed to be at home, supposed to be guarding the girls, supposed to be anywhere except standing in this doorway. Fear because the sirens, even if they weren't audible yet, were now an inevitability rather than a possibility. And then a wild, cornered fury that twisted his handsome features into something that his golf partners and charity dinner companions would not have recognized. "You're lying," Wade spat. "You're bluffing. There's no one coming." "I don't bluff, Wade. Never have. Ask anyone who used to ride with me. Better yet, ask Marlene. She's the one who planned this. All of it. Every document you thought was hidden, she found. Every account number you thought was secret, she memorized. Every move you made tonight, she predicted. You've been outmaneuvered by a woman you thought you broke. And the thing is, Wade, she was never broken. Not for a single day." Something shifted in Wade's face, not just fear, recognition. The slow, sickening realization that the person he'd controlled and beaten and diminished for 8 years had been watching him the entire time, learning him, mapping him, building the architecture of his destruction from inside the cage he'd built around her. "She couldn't have," Wade whispered. "She's not. Not what's smart enough, strong enough. You stood on top of her for 8 years and never once looked down to see if the ground was still solid. It wasn't. She hollowed it out underneath you one night at a time while you were at Sullivan's buying rounds for people who don't even like you." Rattler shifted his weight. Colt locked eyes with him without moving his head. "Don't be stupid, Rattler. I already beat you once. You really want to go round two with the state police on the way?" The professional studied Colt with those calculating eyes. The eyes of a man running numbers. Odds. Distances. Escape routes. The mathematics of survival computed in real time behind a face that showed nothing. "You came here alone," he said. "I did. That was a mistake. Maybe. But I've been making mistakes my whole life. The difference is my mistakes only hurt me. Wade's mistakes buried women in unmarked graves." He let that land. Watched Wade's face twitch. "Sandra Bolin. I know about Sandra. I know about the insurance policy in your lockbox. I know about Martin Prescott. I know about every forged signature, every shell company, every dollar you stole from Marlene and from those girls. The state police know too. So does the FBI. It's done, Wade. All of it. Everything you built is coming down tonight." Wade grabbed the lantern and hurled it against the wall. The room went black. Everything happened at once. Colt dropped low instinct taking over his body, remembering fights in rooms darker than this, his muscles responding to patterns encoded decades ago in the violent classrooms of his youth. Rattler charged predictable as a dog lunging for a bone. Colt caught his arm, twisted it at an angle that the human elbow was not designed to accommodate, and drove his good elbow into the man's throat. Rattler went down, gagging, his body hitting the floor, with the wet, heavy sound of a sack of grain dropped from a truck bed. The professional moved differently. Fast, precise, silent. A trained silence born not from practice, but from repetition so deep it had turned violence into muscle memory and murder into a motor skill. Colt felt the air shift as something swung past his head, close enough to feel the wind of it against his ear. A baton, maybe. Something hard, something designed to end arguments permanently. He stumbled backward. His wrist screamed as he caught himself against the wall. Then a fist connected with his jaw, clean and hard and precise, a punch thrown from the shoulder, rather than the arm carrying the weight of an entire body behind it. Stars exploded across his vision. His teeth clamped together so hard he felt the enamel crack. Colt swung blind and connected with something solid. A shoulder, maybe a chest. The professional grunted. A small sound, the first human sound the man had made. He backed off 2 steps, recalculating. And in that half second of recalculation, Colt pulled the .38 from his waistband. Everybody stopped moving. Right now. Silence. Heavy breathing. The sound of someone scrambling across the floor on hands and knees. Wade heading for the corridor, heading for the stairs. "Wade!" Colt's voice cut through the darkness like a blade through fabric. "Don't run. There's nowhere to go." Footsteps pounded down the corridor, getting fainter. Wade was running anyway. The footsteps hit the metal staircase with a ringing clatter that echoed through the entire building. The professional spoke from somewhere in the darkness. His voice hadn't changed. Still flat, still calm, still the voice of a man reading a grocery list while calculating the optimal distance for a kill shot. You won't shoot me, old man. If you were the type, you'd have done it already. Colt stood in the dark with the gun in his hand and felt the weight of 20 years pressing down on the trigger. 20 years since he'd held this weapon. 20 years since he'd been the kind of man who solved problems by making them stop breathing. 20 years of meatloaf at Wanda's and coffee that was never quite hot enough and the slow grinding work of becoming someone who deserved to exist. His finger rested against the trigger guard. Not on the trigger, against the guard, a distance of 1 centimeter, the distance between who he was and who he used to be. He thought about Lily, who'd hugged him so hard his bruised ribs sang. He thought about Rosie, who held his hand with both of hers and asked him to promise. He thought about Marlene, who had looked at him from across a diner and seen something worth trusting inside a man the rest of the world crossed the street to avoid. He thought about the old Colt, the enforcer, the man with fists full of rage and a heart full of nothing. That man would have pulled the trigger. That man would have solved this problem the way he solved every problem, with finality, with violence, with the bitter satisfaction of a debt collected in blood. But that man wasn't here anymore. You're right, Colt said. I won't shoot you. But I'll hold you here until the people who will lock you up for the rest of your life arrive. And they're coming. You can hear the sirens if you listen. And there they were, faint but growing. The unmistakable wail of multiple police sirens rising from the darkness beyond the mill's broken windows, distant but closing the sound of consequences, finally arriving at the address where they'd been due for a very long time. The professional made a sound that might have been a laugh, short, dry. The laugh of a man who recognizes when the odds have shifted past the point of profitable engagement. Your lucky night, old man. Footsteps moved toward the far end of the room. A window scraped open. A thud outside as the man dropped to the ground and disappeared into the North Carolina darkness, like smoke dissolving into air. Colt didn't chase him. He had one priority, and it wasn't revenge. It wasn't justice. It was making sure that when two little girls woke up tomorrow morning, the world they opened their eyes to was different from the world they'd closed them in. He found the stairs and went down as fast as his battered body would carry him. His wrist throbbed. His jaw was swelling. Blood from the reopened cut on his forehead trickled into his left eye, and he wiped it away with his sleeve without slowing down. Outside, Wade's Mercedes was gone. The white van was gone. Only the SUV remained, Rattler's keys still in the ignition. Colt reached the road just in time to see taillights disappearing west on Route 58. Wade was running, but he didn't get far. A quarter-mile up the road, red and blue lights erupted from behind a tree line, like a sunrise made of emergency. Two state police cruisers pulled onto the highway from a service road blocking both lanes. A third came from the east, boxing Wade in completely. The Mercedes swerved, fishtailed, slid sideways into the drainage ditch with a crunch of metal and a spray of gravel that sounded like applause. Wade's door flew open and he stumbled out with his hands raised, his expensive suit covered in dirt, his perfect hair matted to his forehead, his face a mask of pure undiluted panic. The face underneath the face. The real Wade Crenshaw, stripped of every lie he'd ever worn. The state troopers swarmed. Commands were shouted. Wade was pushed face down under the hood of his own Mercedes and handcuffed with the efficiency of men who had done this 1,000 times and never tired of it. Colt watched from the mill entrance. He sank to his knees on the cracked pavement. Not from defeat, from exhaustion. His body had been running on adrenaline and willpower for 5 days straight, and both accounts were finally empty. He looked down at the .38 still in his hand. Unfired, 6 rounds still in the cylinder, undisturbed, untouched, as patient and unused as the day he'd loaded them 20 years ago. He'd had the gun in his hand in the dark. He'd had a man in front of him who had just described making him disappear. The old Colt, the enforcer, the Hell's Angel with prison tattoos and a rap sheet and a reputation built on broken bones, could have pulled that trigger. Would have pulled that trigger. He didn't, and in not pulling it, in the simple, enormous act of choosing restraint over reflex mercy, over muscle memory, he felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Not innocence. He'd never be innocent. But something clean. Like a man who'd been carrying a debt so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight and had finally set it down. His phone rang. Shelby's voice breathless and cracked with tears. The girls are safe. We're at the barracks in Henderson. Dorothy is holding them. Lily won't stop asking about you. Tell her I kept my promise. Are you okay? Colt looked at his bleeding hands, his torn jacket, the gun in his lap that he hadn't fired and wouldn't fire and was finished carrying. Yeah, he said, I'm okay. A state trooper approached, weapon holstered, hand extended. Mr. Drayton, Sergeant Coulter, State Police. Father Sharp called us. We're going to need your statement. You'll get it, every word. But I need you to do something first. What's that call, Cedar Falls Memorial Hospital? Room 214, tell Marlene Prescott that her girls are safe and it's over. The trooper nodded once and walked away, his boots crunching on gravel that was lit red and blue by the lights of 6 patrol cars and the headlights of a Channel 7 news van that had just pulled up to the edge of the scene. Colt leaned his head back against the cold brick wall and closed his eyes. Somewhere inside the mill, Rattler McKee was being read his rights. Down the road, Wade Crenshaw sat in the back of a state police cruiser, his charming smile finally and permanently erased. And 50 miles north, in a barracks break room that smelled like bad coffee and floor wax, 2 little blonde girls held hands and waited for the phone to ring. The phone at the Henderson barracks rang at 4:17 in the morning. Dorothy answered it. She listened for 12 seconds. Then she dropped to her knees on the break room floor and started crying in a way that shook her entire body. 70-something years of grief and hope and fury and love, all releasing at once like a dam that had finally found its breaking point. Lily grabbed her grandmother's arm. What happened? Is it, Mama? Is it? Mr. Colt, Dorothy pulled both girls into her arms so tight they squeaked. It's over, she said. Her voice came apart on the word over, splitting into pieces the way voices do when they're carrying more than any single word was designed to hold. They got him. Wade is in jail. It's over, babies. It's really over. Rosie didn't cry. She didn't speak. She pressed her face into Dorothy's shoulder and went boneless with relief. The tension she'd been carrying since the day she ran into that diner, maybe since long before that finally let go. And Colt Drayton, sitting on the cold ground outside an abandoned mill, had kept his promise. What followed was 3 weeks that dismantled the machinery of Wade Crenshaw's life, piece by piece. 3 weeks that proved what Marlene Prescott had always known, that the truth, once it starts moving, is heavier than any lie built to contain it. FBI Special Agent Diane Holbrook arrived from the Charlotte field office within hours of Wade's arrest. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed with reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose, and the focused intensity of someone who had been building a case from the outside and had just been handed the keys to every room she'd been trying to enter for 18 months. She sat across from Colt in an interrogation room at the state police headquarters in Raleigh and listened as he laid out everything. The diner, the girls, Marlene on the floor, the Cartier watch and the empty refrigerator, the lockbox and the shell companies, Sandra Boland's insurance policy, Marlene's 2-year operation, Helen's flash drive, Dorothy's research, Father Sharp's midnight phone calls. All of it, every thread, every connection, every piece of the web that a battered woman and a broken biker and a scared librarian and a grieving grandmother had assembled from inside a system designed to keep them silent. When he finished, Holbrook leaned back in her chair. Mr. Drayton, she said, we've had an open investigation into Wade Crenshaw for 1.5 years. Financial irregularities flagged by a bank in Mercer County. But we couldn't get enough to move. Local law enforcement was uncooperative. Witnesses kept recanting. Crenshaw had too many people insulating him. You knew about him for 18 months, Colt said, and a woman almost died. We knew about the financial crimes. We didn't know about the domestic violence. Crenshaw compartmentalized. The abuse was invisible to our investigation. It wasn't invisible to the girls. The room went quiet. Agent Holbrook set down her pen. She looked at Colt with something that wasn't quite apology and wasn't quite admiration, but lived somewhere in the space between the two. You're right, and I'm sorry, but what you and Mrs. Prescott have given us tonight, the lockbox documents, the insurance policies, the flash drive, this changes everything. This isn't just a fraud case anymore. This is potentially a double homicide. Triple, Colt said, if you count what he tried to do to Marlene. The charges against Wade Crenshaw accumulated like stones on a cairn. Federal counts of wire fraud, insurance fraud, money laundering through shell companies, state charges of assault with intent to kill, conspiracy to kidnap, 2 counts of suspected homicide pending investigation. The news broke nationally. Father Sharp's midnight call to Channel 7 had worked exactly as Marlene predicted it would. Within a week, every television in America was showing footage of Wade Crenshaw being led into the Raleigh federal courthouse in handcuffs, his suit wrinkled, his hair unwashed, his face a blank mask that no longer fooled anyone. A forensic team excavated a property in Mercer County based on coordinates found in Wade's handwritten journal. On the third day of digging, in a clearing behind a collapsed barn on land that Wade's shell company had purchased 11 years ago, they found human remains. Sandra Bolin, missing for 9 years. A woman who had inherited money from her grandmother and had the misfortune of catching the eye of a man who saw dollar signs where other men saw a human being. She was finally coming home. Her parents in Asheville, who had never stopped searching, who had spent nearly a decade suspended in the particular hell of not knowing who had kept her bedroom exactly as she left it and her phone number active, and her Christmas stocking hung by the fireplace every December, would finally have an answer. A terrible answer, the worst answer, but an answer, and there is a kind of mercy and certainty, even the cruelest kind. The not knowing is what destroys you. The knowing, however awful, at least gives grief a place to stand. Martin Prescott's body was exhumed from Cedar Falls Cemetery. The new autopsy, conducted by the state medical examiner, rather than the local coroner who had handled the original case, confirmed what Dorothy Prescott had known in her bones for 8 years. The entry angle of the bullet was inconsistent with a self-inflicted or accidental wound. Martin Prescott's death was reclassified as a homicide. Jonas Kelm, the professional from the mill, was picked up crossing the Virginia border 3 days later. He cooperated immediately with the pragmatic efficiency of a man who understands that loyalty is a luxury the losing side cannot afford. His testimony dismantled Wade's network completely. 2 sheriff's deputies were suspended. Deputy Roy Skaggs, the man who had sat in Wanda's diner with a badge on his belt and a mouthful of sandwich, while 2 children screamed for help, resigned before they could fire him. Wade Crenshaw faced life without parole on the federal charges alone. No bail, no deal. The prosecutors rejected his cooperation offer. They didn't need it. Marlene's documents, Helen's flash drive, Dorothy's research, Colt's testimony, and Jonas Kell's detailed account of Wade's operations gave them more than enough to build a case that would take years to try and decades to appeal, and would end eventually and inevitably with a man dying in a cell. Colt delivered Marlene's message to Dorothy in person. He drove to the farmhouse on Willow Creek Road on a Tuesday morning, hat in hand, and the first time in his life he'd ever held a hat in his hand for anyone. The gravel driveway crunched under his tires. The farmhouse sat quiet in the morning light, white clapboard with green shutters, a vegetable garden along the south side, a porch swing that moved slightly in the breeze, as if a ghost were sitting in it, rocking slowly, watching the road, waiting. Dorothy was at the door before he cut the engine. She was always waiting. 8 years of waiting had turned it into her default state, the way some people's resting expression is a smile or a frown. Dorothy's was vigilance. Coffee was on the table, 2 cups. She'd known he was coming the way she seemed to know everything, not through information, but through the deep, bone-level intuition of a mother who has lost her son and spent nearly a decade listening to the world for the sound of justice finally arriving. She already knows, Dorothy said before Colt could speak. Marlene called me yesterday. We talked for 3 hours. She paused. First time I've heard her voice in 8 years. She asked me to tell you something. Dorothy's hands tightened around her coffee cup. She said to tell you she never wanted this life. She said she's sorry for everything. Dorothy Prescott wept, not quietly, not politely. She wept with the full-throated grief of a woman who had lost her son, watched her grandchildren disappear behind closed doors, and spent 8 years being told she was wrong about the man responsible for all of it. Colt sat across from her and let her cry. Some grief needs space. Some pain earns the right to be loud. And Dorothy Prescott had earned it 8 times over. 4 weeks after the arrest, the guardianship hearing took place at the Millhaven Courthouse. The same courtroom where Wade Crenshaw had been arraigned now served a different purpose entirely. Colt wore a suit, the second time in his life. The tie felt like a slow strangulation, and the jacket pulled tight across his shoulders like it was trying to hold him back from something, but he wore it because Lily had told him he should look nice for the judge. And he had discovered over the past 5 weeks that refusing a 7-year-old girl was harder than fighting 4 men in a parking lot. Father Sharp sat in the gallery. So did Helen Jessup, Mrs. Opal Tanner, Wanda Fitz, and Iron Jim Culver, who had put on a clean flannel shirt for the occasion and looked profoundly uncomfortable in a room full of lawyers. But the moment that silenced the courtroom didn't belong to Colt. It belonged to Marlene. She walked in under her own power. No wheelchair, no cane, no one holding her arm. She walked through the courtroom doors the way a woman walks who has spent 8 years being pushed down and has decided finally and absolutely to stand up. She moved slowly, and the effort was visible in the careful placement of each step, in the way she held her ribcage still, while her legs did the work, in the slight tremor in her hands that she controlled by clasping them together in front of her. She wore a simple blue dress, no jewelry, no Cartier watch, no Louis Vuitton bag, no camouflage of any kind. Just a woman standing upright in a room full of people who were seeing her clearly for the first time. The last time most of them had seen her face, it had been on the evening news, swollen and stitched a photograph taken at the hospital that showed only the damage. Now they saw the woman underneath the damage, the woman who had survived it, the woman who had been planning her way through it while the rest of the world looked away. She stood before Judge Nadine Harrell and asked permission to address the court. The judge nodded, and Marlene Prescott, who had spent 8 years being silenced, spoke. For 8 years I lived in a cage that looked like a house. I was beaten, robbed, isolated, and told I was crazy. Every system that should have protected me failed. The police failed. The courts failed. The neighbors who heard me scream through the walls failed. Her voice didn't waver. It filled the courtroom the way water fills a vessel, completely, without rushing, finding every corner and edge. But I never stopped fighting. I hid documents for 2 years. I memorized account numbers. I found an ally and a librarian who risked everything to help me. I trained my 7-year-old daughters to execute an escape plan. I watched a man through a diner window for 6 months because he was the only person in this town that my husband couldn't buy, couldn't scare, and couldn't control. She took a breath. It cost her, but she took it. I am not here as a victim. I am here as a mother who refused to let her children grow up in fear. And I am asking this court to recognize the man who answered when I called. Not because he was qualified, but because he was willing. The courtroom was silent. Judge Harrell removed her glasses, pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose. When she put them back on, her eyes were bright. She turned to Colt. Mr. Drayton, you have a criminal record. Aggravated assault, 4 years in state prison, 25 years in the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Help me understand why this court should grant you legal guardianship of 2 minor children. Colt stood up. His knees protested, but he stood. Your Honor, everything you just said about me is true. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I was a violent man. I hurt people. I served my time, and I earned every day of that sentence. There is nothing in my past that qualifies me to raise children. He paused. The courtroom waited. But those 2 girls didn't run to someone qualified. They ran to someone willing. I was sitting in a diner eating meatloaf, and they grabbed my jacket and begged me to save their mother. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have credentials. I just had 2 hands and a willingness to use them for something good for once in my life. I can't change what I was, but I can choose what I am. And what I am is a man who will protect those girls with everything I have, not because I deserve to, because they chose me and their mother chose me, and that's a responsibility I intend to carry for the rest of my life. The judge looked at the girls. Lily, Rosemary, do you understand what's happening today? Lily nodded. Mr. Colt is going to be our family, for real, on paper. And is that what you both want? It was Rosie who answered. Quiet Rosie. Rosie, who spoke in drawings and hand squeezes and the silent twin language that needed no words. She stood up from her chair and looked at the judge with those impossibly old blue eyes. He came for us, every time. When we were scared, he came. When the bad men tried to take us, he came. When Mama was hurt, he stayed. She paused. That's what family does. Judge Harrell was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was not entirely steady. I've sat on this bench for 22 years. I've presided over hundreds of custody hearings, and I have never heard a more compelling argument for what makes a family than what I've just heard from a 7-year-old girl. She signed the papers. The courtroom erupted. Father Sharp wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. Helen hugged Wanda. Iron Jim stood and clapped his enormous hands together like thunder rolling through a mountain pass. Lily tackled Colt before he could step away from the podium. Rosie was right behind her. He went down on one knee and caught them both, pulling them against his chest, with arms that had once broken bones for money and now held something infinitely more valuable. "We're a family now," Lily announced to the entire courtroom. "For real. For real," Colt confirmed. His voice was rough as gravel dragged across sandstone. Marlene knelt beside them and put her arms around all three. Dorothy joined, her arthritic hands trembling as she placed them on Colt's shoulders. "My Martin would have loved this," Dorothy whispered. "My son would have loved every second of this." 2 days later, Colt drove to Iron Jim Culver's salvage yard outside town. The old Hells Angels founder was underneath a 1978 Harley shovelhead cursing at a rusted bolt when Colt pulled in. "Hand me that wrench," Jim grunted without looking up. Colt found the wrench and handed it over. He sat on an overturned bucket and waited. Jim always finished what he was working on before he gave you his full attention. It was one of the things Colt had always respected about him. When Jim finally rolled out from under the bike, his face was smeared with grease and his gray beard was tangled. He looked at Colt and his eyes narrowed. "You look different. I feel different. Saw the news. Whole country talking about you." Jim wiped his hands on a ring that was dirtier than his hands. "You did good, brother." Colt reached into his jacket and pulled out something he'd carried for over 20 years. His old Hells Angels patch. Faded, the edges frayed, the colors muted by 2 decades of sitting in a shoebox at the bottom of a closet. Unable to throw it away, unable to put it on. A relic of a life that had defined him completely and then failed him absolutely. He held it out to Jim. "I want you to have this." Jim stared at the patch. His weathered face moved through something complicated. Something that had no name in the vocabulary men like them had been given. "You sure?" "I'm sure. That patch meant everything to me once. It told me who I was, what I was worth, what I was willing to die for." Colt laid it on the workbench between them. "I don't need it anymore. I've found something that tells me all of that and more." Jim picked up the patch and turned it over in his grease-stained fingers. "Your old man gave you this. Day you got patched in, I was there." "I know. He'd be proud of what you did, Colt. Even prouder of this." Jim tucked the patch into his shirt pocket. "I'll put it on the wall in the clubhouse. With the others. The brothers who found their way out. I didn't just find my way out, Jim. I've found my way in. Into something better." Jim looked at him for a long time. Then he extended his hand. Colt took it. The handshake was firm and final, and full of everything neither man had the words or the willingness to say out loud. "Go take care of those girls," Jim said. "That's an order." That evening, the 5 of them gathered at Colt's house on Pimmon Road. Marlene heated soup on the stove. Dorothy sat at the kitchen table teaching Rosie how to play gin rummy with a deck of cards that was missing the 7 of clubs. Lily lay on the living room floor with Rebel, trying to teach the ancient Labrador to shake hands. The dog was not cooperating. Lily's patience was limitless. Colt stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, watching all of it. His house was loud. His house was messy. There were shoes by the door that weren't his small shoes, pink shoes with glitter on them that got everywhere and would probably still be turning up in the carpet fibers 5 years from now. A pink backpack hung on the hook that used to hold his motorcycle helmet. Crayon drawings covered the refrigerator, held up by magnets, shaped like motorcycles that Mrs. Tanner had given him as a joke years ago. And in the center of all those drawings, pinned at 7-year-old eye level, was the one Rosie had drawn at the hospital. A house with flowers and a sun in the corner, and 4 stick figures standing in front of it. 2 small ones holding hands, 1 tall one with brown hair, and 1 very large one with yellow scribbles on his arms. "That's you," Rosie had said when she gave it to him. "See, those are your tattoos. You can keep it. For your refrigerator." His hands, scarred, tattooed, built for violence, had trembled when he took it. "You're staring," Marlene said, appearing beside him with 2 mugs of coffee. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how a man who spent 25 years destroying things ended up in a room full of things worth keeping." She handed him the coffee. "You didn't end up here, you chose it. Every day since that diner, you chose it." From the living room, Lily shouted, "Uncle Colt Rebel licked my entire face. That means he likes you. It means he's disgusting. Lily shrieked with delight. Dorothy chuckled from the kitchen table. Rosie laid down a winning hand and pumped her small fist in silent triumph. Later, after Dorothy went home and Marlene took the girls to their new apartment on Maple Street, Colt sat on his front porch with Rebel at his feet. The North Carolina night was warm and full of crickets. Stars scattered across the sky like someone had thrown a handful of diamonds against black velvet. He looked at his hands in the dim porch light. The tattoos across his knuckles, HOLD, on the right, FAST on the left, were faded and blurred with age. They'd been put there by a man in a prison cell with a sewing needle and ballpoint ink 35 years ago by a version of Colt Drayton who believed that holding fast meant never letting go of your anger, your loyalty to the club, your willingness to do violence on behalf of men who would do violence on behalf of you. Those same hands now held coffee mugs, steadied bicycles, checked homework, pinned a child's drawing to a refrigerator with a motorcycle magnet. They were the same hands, but they belonged to a different man. His phone buzzed one last time. Father Sharp. How does it feel? Colt typed back. Like the first day of the rest of my life. That's exactly what it is. Good night, Colt. Good night, Leland. He put the phone in his pocket and looked up at the sky. Somewhere out there, Sandra Boland's parents were finally grieving their daughter properly with answers instead of questions. Dorothy Prescott was sleeping peacefully for the first time in 8 years. Marlene was tucking 2 little girls into beds where no one would ever hurt them again. And Wade Crenshaw was staring at the ceiling of a federal holding cell, stripped of every lie he'd ever told, every mask he'd ever worn, every smile he'd ever faked alone, with the only companion he had left. The truth about who he really was. Colt Ironside Drayton, 61 years old, former Hells Angels enforcer, ex-convict, the most feared man in Millhaven, sat on his porch in the dark and listened to the crickets sing. He was a guardian now, a protector, part of a family that had been forged not in blood, but in choice, not in comfort, but in crisis. Not because he deserved it, not because he'd earned it through a lifetime of good deeds, but because 2 little girls in torn sundresses had run into a diner, grabbed his jacket with 4 small hands, and decided that the scariest man in the room was the safest place they knew. And they were right, because their mother had made sure of it.